The true crisis in our world today is not social, political, or economic. Our crisis is a crisis of consciousness, an inability to directly experience our true nature, an inability to recognize this nature in everyone and in all things. Realizing that there is only one consciousness. To awaken one's true self, one must awaken all beings. There are innumerable sentient beings in the universe. I vow to help them all to awaken. My imperfections are inexhaustible. I vow to overcome them all. The Dharma is unknowable. I vow to know it. The way of awakening is unattainable. I vow to attain it. Good morning, friends. Good afternoon, good evening, and good night. This is your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo, and those words can be found in a documentary/film called The Inner Worlds, Outer Worlds, which you can find on YouTube. Whatever their original intent, those words were so powerfully moving to me the first time I encountered them that since that point I have tried to recite them as my daily mantra. One might ask the question, why? And I think the answer is contained directly in the words as they are organized. We live in a world riddled with crisis after crisis after crisis. Shocking and disturbing and unusual and over the top as things may have gotten in recent years, I believe that this statement remains valid and true about everything we're going through. We are being manipulated. The system of manipulation, the system of oppression, some call it the secret cabal, some call it the New World Order. Whatever label is preferred, that system wants us focused on impossible conflicts and crises of a social, political, or economic nature. But that is not what is going on. That is not the true problem. That is not the root of our situation here. Those things that we are lured by, those distractions, some of them valid, many of them powerfully impactful on our daily lives, many of them frivolous and nonsensical. And we can sit around debating which is which, or we can burn past the entire cloud of distractionary labels and finger pointing and understand what truly sits at the center of it all. And that is, as whoever authored these words so concisely put it, a crisis of consciousness. Or perhaps a crisis of unconsciousness. Our awareness is so distracted by ideology and the argumentation thereof that we suffer an inability to directly experience our true nature. Now, this sentence alone is mind-blowingly significant. This sentence alone can, if you welcome it into your field of awareness, deep into your consciousness, have a huge impact. We suffer from an inability to directly experience our true nature. What a strange thing to say, right? How can any one of us be blocked from our own self? Reminds me of the meme about nature and being disconnected from it. To say that we have been disconnected from nature is to acknowledge that we have been disconnected from ourselves, because what are we if not the most vociferous and active of the children of nature? What are we if we are not the most ambulatory and wildly overthinking aspect of nature? What are we if nothing else but one form amongst many forms of nature? We are not separate from nature. Whether you think that we naturally evolved here on this little thing we call a planet, or whether you think some lizard people from another place came and had sex with monkeys, or any of the theories in between, all of it is inseparable from itself when you zoom out to the fullest range and scope and magnitude of what nature is. We are inseparable from it, no matter what our parentage or lineage may be. We are inseparable from nature, no matter how much the ideological constructs of race and religion may distract us from that fact. We are inseparable from it the way a leaf is inseparable from a tree. And yet, here we are in a postmodern world where the average human being feels pain and suffering because of this strange disconnection from nature. And even if we go hiking or camping or get lost in the woods, we still feel deeply and problematically disconnected from nature. And that's not because we cannot somehow bridge the divide between us and the babbling brook or the gorgeous scenery around us. It is not because there's some missing thing that we no longer know about that keeps us apart from the woods or the trees or the fields and the glens. It is because we do not remember how to directly experience ourselves without a bunch of ideological bullshit getting in the way. That's the real crisis, folks. Everyone's arguing about what causes this and what causes that. What causes active shooter events? Is it guns? Is it drugs? Is it a government agency program designed to brainwash people to become active shooters? Is it hate? Is it racism? I suggest to you, my dear friends, that while all of these may be plausible causes, while all of these may be even more realistically a set of contributing factors, if we dig deep enough at the root, at the core, at the very bottom of the barrel, there is this crisis of consciousness, this inability to directly experience and understand, comprehend, and know our own true nature. And, of course, by extension, as the next sentence tells us, we suffer an inability to recognize this true nature in every living being and in all objects that surround us. If we cannot see our true nature in ourselves, how are we ever to see it in anyone else? Or worse, we get deceived about that nature and we get told that it only resides in someone else or can only be found somewhere else. And those lies cause more trauma in all of us. Those distractions cause more trauma in each of us. Now, I cannot pretend to have discovered this. I can only confirm to you that given the correct, and that word is of course very loaded and misleading, but given one's exploration of the tools available to us to rediscover, to open up, to dislodge the blockage, and to connect deep within oneself, it is entirely, organically, naturally possible to heal that inability, to once again directly experience our own true nature, to once again be able to recognize that true divine nature not only in ourselves, for if we only think, I am divine, we instantly fall into an ego trap, do we not? But to recognize it in all living people and in all inanimate objects. That there is indeed a toolbox or a path or a workflow that will help us to realize that there is only one consciousness, that consciousness is having many experiences, from the most banal and mundane as the coffee cup I am holding or the tea that I am drinking, to the most sophisticated and complex, as whatever the most sophisticated and complex life form in the universe might be, whether it is us, which I would suggest is the height of hubris, or whether it is the cosmos itself. And those tools have been around forever. Those workflows, those practices, those traditions, those internal methodologies of healing and reunification have always been available to us because they, like the very phenomena of being itself, are inborn. They are our birthright. They are not some secret special reward for being X, Y, and Z. They are not some elite, reserved privilege for this person or that person, but like being alive itself, they are available to all that is life. It is hard work, though, because the layers of distraction, the endless amount of brainwashing that we have all suffered, not just in this lifetime, but in every lifetime before this, the amount of mental scar tissue and trauma that is preventing us from having this realization, it's vivid and it's real and it is valid in and of itself. Never should it be mistaken that the spiritual path is about denying oneself one's own experience as this body or as this personality. For duality and non-duality always coexist. It is the height of folly to think that one is superior than the other. Duality and non-duality, in fact, co-create one another. So all appearing to be mutually exclusive dichotomies, all things that seem to be in a position pardon my lack of clear pronunciation there, all things that appear to be in opposition to one another, all things that seem to be enemies, are in fact partners in creating each other. Can you have up without down? Can you have left without right? It is foolish to insist that that can be so, and yet we are encouraged to think that way. There is a historical reason as to why we have been fooled, why we have been manipulated and oppressed and force-fed this onslaught of nonsense that has resulted in the inability to directly experience our true divine nature. And we can get lost in the weeds analyzing that. We can spend a lifetime going through the historical record and going, oh, well, here we go, this, but it boils down to this, I think, in my humble opinion, acknowledging that I might be wrong, but I think it bears out. Profiteering. If one understands the story of the Tower of Babel as a representation of our collective effort to achieve enlightenment, the tower itself representing an outward physical representation of the human species learning and understanding how to truly, quote, open the third eye, meaning the tower represents the pineal gland, not whatever the fuck else people have proposed it might mean or represent. And we realize that when we attribute it being struck down by God, which is a silly thing for God to do, why on earth would God prevent us from reuniting with it if it is in fact us? It just prevented itself from reuniting with itself. Of course, ultimately, that is all that's going on. God's playing the game. With whom? None other than itself. But in terms of our practical experiences here, in the confusion of not remembering that we ourselves are just projections of the divine entity, the Tower of Babel was struck down not by God, I think, the light, right? But by its twin, the darkness, our ego, our collective ego, which one could say is what is meant by Satan or the devil. And by knocking down the Tower of Babel, by destroying all the work and progress we had made towards achieving a reunification and an enlightenment of the whole species, we were, as slaves of ego, able to force ourselves as a species to slave away, starting over from scratch, allowing ego to enjoy another round on the merry-go-round of life and death and profiteering, the meat grinder. That's the game we play here. The ancients called it many names, and we can get lost in the weeds about which name is closer to the truth and whatnot, and which culture got it most correct and whatnot. But those are meaningless things to get lost in the weeds about. What is powerful and meaningful is what happens when any individual member of the collective truly, deeply, personally, undeniably, undebunkably has a phenomenological experience that leads to the realization that ultimately, behind all the smoke and mirrors, underneath all the masks and costumes, deep at the center of the phenomenological experience of being life, there is only one unity of consciousness experiencing all of it. Understanding that leads us to remember that this ride we are riding, this whirlpool of being alive, this theatrical show of being people, it has its natural course and trajectory. And while we have temporal free will, we can improvise in the midst of playing out the script, and we can keep adding acts. We can make the show longer and longer and longer, but ultimately, the show must end. The game must be concluded. And while there's a lot of distractionary talk about the end of the game being a grand war between good and evil, that ultimately can be proven as nothing but nonsense, since good and evil, like up and down, are mutually arising illusory dichotomies that are merely expressions of the fractal unfolding of the divine unity. And that only our little tiny ego consciousnesses here in the material realm have determined and decided and cast it as a war. War is something we made up here. I really highly doubt that in the true ethereal realms beyond the material, that there is any such thing as war. Especially not the kind of war that we typically think of here, in which both sides are profiteering on the butchering of the people fighting it. One of the hardest pills to swallow, because we get impassioned by these ideological constructs and these material needs that we encounter in this 4D fully immersive video movie matrix hologram we call being alive in the material realm. We get addicted to them. We get addicted to the passions of life. We get addicted to the joys and the thrills and the sensory pleasures and the ideological constructs and the winning and the losing and the pain and the pleasure. We get addicted to it. But one of the hardest pills to swallow is that the cosmos does not actually need most of the things we've made up for ourselves to get passionate about here in the universe. We, as ambulatory talking meat sacks with brains sophisticated enough to project out into the material realm, we as creators, as co-creators, using and abusing the rules that exist in the phenomenological matrix of this place we call reality, we have created a bunch of shit that the cosmos at large does not give two fucks about. The cosmos at large, for we only occupy and perceive a tiny little portion of it, right? That's the distinction I'm making when I say things like the cosmos in its totality, the cosmos at large, the universe, the living fractal matrix that is the whole thing. It is impossibly larger than the 1% of data we can interpret with these talking meatbag sensory apparatuses that we reside in here. This spacesuit that we wear can only receive about 1.4% of what's going on in the cosmos at large. At least in the mode of operations that we've jammed ourselves in order to perpetuate our silly, nonsensical, ideological-driven profiteering on conflict. Since the Tower of Babel, we have busied ourselves with the game of organized murder for profit and all the ancillary businesses that arise from that. But once we come to an understanding that there is no enemy, because all the people that are playing the game are in fact just meat puppets for this one divine unity of consciousness. And once we realize that, and we come to the realization that the rest of the universe doesn't give two shits about ideology, about politics, about profit, about war, about all the other things that we're attached to, even the lovely and delightful ones, the universe is operating at such a larger metastructural level that none of those things are of any importance in the grand scheme of things. Now, I don't mean to piss in anyone's parade. That does not mean we should not do these things. What it can mean is that if we understand that none of them are significant, then we can choose only to enjoy the ones that are not torturous and painful and traumatic and sadistic and anchored in the nonsensical self-manipulation of being stuck to the addiction of butchering each other for one small percentage of our being's profit. For money itself and material items and profit as some sort of aspirant goal in life are rendered meaningless. That is all contained within the sentence, realizing there is only one consciousness. And from that realization, we can then return to this mundane life with a higher order priority than making money, etc., etc., etc. Realizing that there is only one consciousness, we can return to our mundane lives and focus on awakening to our true self, of healing that blockage, of healing that inability to directly experience our true nature. And by healing that in ourselves and experiencing our true divine nature, we empower everyone around us to heal themselves and dislodge this blockage, get rid of the blinders, and truly experience and recognize this true divine nature in everyone and in all things. And so we can focus on awakening ourselves and vis-a-vis the relationship we have to all others, awaken all beings. And like all oxymorons, we find ourselves in a precarious place where we must commit ourselves to something that the average Joe Schmo on the street will tell you is impossible. But I say to you, my friends, if we fall for that logic that it is impossible, then we are voting for it to be impossible. Let us instead vote for it to be possible. If the living holographic matrix is, as I've talked about in other episodes, like a giant interactive living video game in which your very belief system votes for what you want to be going on, both in your private universe and in the collective shared universe that we all co-create together, why are we voting for idiotic, self-destructive things when we can be voting for the awakening of all beings? We can be voting for the healing of all that exist. We can be voting for the overcoming of our inexhaustible imperfections, both as individuals and as a collective. We can be voting for the magical and impossible knowledge of the Dharma, whatever the fuck that is, the ineffable beyond. We can be voting for the true and ultimate awakening, instead of voting for another round of political bullshit. That is why I, on occasion, like to share these words with you, my dear listeners, because I hope that upon hearing them again and upon discussing them again and trying to unpack them again, they reach deeper into your consciousness through the many layers of brainwashing and lies and true things that aren't true. And that's a whole nother episode, because there are real things that seem true that are not in fact true. But we'll have to put a pin in that. But I invite you to join me in contemplating this mantra as often as possible, so that it may get into you deep down and help you begin your journey of healing or advance your journey of healing. The true crisis in our world is not social, political, or economic. Those are just window dressing. Those are just symptoms of the deeper problem. Therefore, let go of your anger at Trump. Let go of your anger at the Democrats or the Republicans or this person or that race or this race or that country or this one. Because our crisis is a crisis of consciousness. And the true revolution is to be had deep down inside that rabbit hole that is the question, where is my consciousness? Look within, friends, for that is where the true revolution will occur. And the revolution will be the healing of this inability to directly experience our true nature. And through healing ourselves, we will heal each other's inability to recognize this nature in every single being and in every single inanimate object. For once we collectively come to the realization that there is only one consciousness, we will fully be able to awaken one's true self, our collective true self, through the magical, perpetual, and I don't say magical in a dismissive way. There is true things in the universe that we can call nothing else but magic. And people go, there's no such thing as magic. Oh yeah? Explain to me how you know how to breathe. You can't. You do it. And you can get into a technical breakdown of how your lungs work. But how is it that you keep breathing even when you're distracted with a bunch of other nonsense? That, my friends, is magic. And once we get past these inabilities and break through to these realizations, we will understand as individuals that we are not separate from the innumerable sentient beings that exist throughout the universe. And we will be able, as individuals and as communities, to dedicate our lives to the vow of helping everyone to awaken. Not just to a little epiphany here about the way the war profiteers work, or a little realization there that taxation is theft, or rather abusive lending, because they don't really steal the money from you. They give it back to you if you understand how taxes work. But that's a whole nother episode. But to realize that we can awaken all beings in the universe despite the fact that there are a million uncountable sentient beings in the universe, That is how we will overcome our imperfections. For who is perfect? As Christ said, let ye without sin cast the first stone. And even the nicest of people have flaws. Even the most heroic of heroes have flaws. Except for the innocence of newborns. Right? And to overcome those flaws is to be able to uplift the entire species into the awareness of the Dharma. To heal those inexhaustible flaws and traumas and scars and damage that we have caused to one another over the last millennia. That is how we will uplift the entire species and then the entire collection of undiscovered life in the entire universe into the way of awakening. As always, friends, thank you for tuning in and taking the time to consider the madness that comes out of my mouth. I hope that peace, love, and grooviness blossoms in your heart and that you find your path into that healing place deep within, behind all the nonsense that our forefathers programmed into us. Bless their hearts, they didn't realize, right? But we realize now. The calling is now. There is no better time than now to awaken.